Welcome and thank you for sharing your Saturday morning with us. In following modern day customs, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Poetry Foundation, HMS Media, and especially Catherine, as well as handfuls of arts patrons that I call friends and family. Big shout out to the Humanities Fest, and thank you, Tiff, and the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events in the City of Chicago, and my fiscal sponsor, Open Hands Studios. In following the customs of Indigenous people, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land we're on, with 25 to 30 tribes claiming the Chicago area as their ancestral lands. And if I'd like to introduce our panelists, who will be up here shortly, Alaka Wali is the curator of North American Anthropology in the Science and Education Division of the Field Museum and adjunct professor at Northwestern University. She was the founding director of the Center for Cultural Understanding and Change, and her current research focuses on relationship between art and the capacity for social resilience. Sam Cook, here from Australia, is the founder of social enterprises Nomad's Palace and the Real Aussie Company. It's Australia's first global Indigenous franchise, so I'm hoping it comes to Chicago sometime soon. She's a writer, visual artist, graphic designer, and founder of Kiss My Black Arts, an artist management and apparel company. Great name, right? Sam's a two-time recipient of the UK Arts Council Fellowship and founder of Australia's Black History Month and SOS Black Australia, which is the biggest change offensive in Indigenous Australia in the 21st century. A little bit of backstory about Artists of the First Sunrise. It's a documentary that looks at who we are as humanity, where we came from, expression through the arts, and how culture plays a part of all of this. So about 9 years ago, my family and I visited Australia, and I met an Indigenous woman named Ruby Neal, and she told me about not just the plight of her family, but that of the Indigenous people, the original people of Australia who lived on the island since time immemorial. So if you could even think back, it's not 20, 30, 40,000 years, it's the first person who stepped on the island. And for almost 250 years of colonization or invasion, depending on whose eyes you're looking through, the Indigenous people have had their human rights stripped from them, beginning with when the first settlers stepped on shore, labeling the country terra nullius, meaning uninhabited. Since then, the Indigenous people have been appealing for the right to a distinct status and culture which would maintain and strengthen the identity and spiritual practices of Indigenous communities. Last year, Australia's human rights record was scrutinized by more than 100 countries in the United Nations, with the treatment of asylum seekers and Indigenous people drawing particular criticism. And regardless where we all call home, freedoms and rights should be inherent without any discrimination at all. And this could be witnessed today at Standing Rock Indian Reservation in North Dakota. So let's tie this into what the Humanities Fest theme is, which is speed. And the children of the first sunrise have been harmonious with the earth since the very first step their ancestors took on the sacred land of Australia. They have, however, experienced the destruction of their traditional ways of life, languages, culture in the short time span of 250 years. The pace of this demise of the culture is astounding, and the rapid tempo at which Indigenous people and supporters like us need to move in order to preserve these dreaming traditions and teach non-Indigenous people about their crisis is also remarkable. So this 10-minute short that you will be seeing in a moment is evocative of what the full-length Artists of the First Sunrise documentary will be. It will highlight the creative arts of the First Nations people and the art that they produce really to heal themselves and teach future generations about their traditions and their plight. So until the full-length work is completed, please enjoy the 10-minute short. And in doing so, while you're viewing, please allow these words and images to take on a life of their own, and the rhythms and cadences open up a floodgate of sympathies. Feel the heartbeats of those who are speaking and the lifeblood of their experiences they contain. Please enjoy.
At birth, we cried for the rope of our mother's navel. No steps towards the gallows. No ropes put about our legs, our wrists, our hips, by the men with the hood, the gavel or the strangers. No proclamation as firstborn did we receive, yet born unto his majesty. Though from whence we cried, 'tis for our dignity back black and intact. No land for toil, and no space to bring billy to the boil. Yet so much barren our eyes doth see. We know simple, no pagan, man heathen shall be. A distant rumbling of mountains weep, our kingdom removed as we sleep. Yet you might wake on the morrow, 'cause your kingdom's burning, and yea, for the castle we sorrow. Though this be a proclamation we doth send, by Kookaburra, thine holy mail, our hearts are not rent. They say we drink, we steal, we gamble, they curse when they bet. A distant rumbling of mountains weep, our kingdom removed as we slept.
The first thing that's important is to understand that it is a pluralistic notion. This Aboriginal Australia is a monocultural statement. There are over 800 tribal nations within Australia. There's distinct customs and culture, and how do you quantify and sort of describe 800 tribes?
Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal people are diverse as any other nation in the world. We have light skin like me, we have more traditional people that live out in remote areas. We also have more traditional people that live in city areas, and more my skin type living in remote areas. When I go out on country, when I'm on the land, I'm like a sponge. I feel fulfilled. I feel that this is where I'm meant to be.
I feel like no longer is this earth any different to me. That my bubble, this land and me are one. We're sitting there together. When you're in ceremony and when you're in dance and when you're in prayer, that's it. There's no separation between the breath of the wind and the breath of us.
We are actually related to the trees and the animals through kinship names. And that's why if we leave our land, our spirit dies with us. And if the land isn't there, if it's destroyed, we begin to pine away. But through my music, I feel the land. I feel how that it portrays itself.
We as humans have become really disconnected from essentially the ritual and the ceremony that once upon a time existed in all of our lives, no matter what ethnicity you come from. For me, as an Aboriginal person living in the city, I'm constantly craving that opportunity to go home and dance with family.
So we might be economically poor, but we come from such a strong foundation that is, non-quantifiable in a financial or economic, world.
Our art is essential to our essence, our soul. And when I talk about art, people sometimes misconstrue art as painting or photography. Art is in everyday living.
There is no written history in Australian Indigenous culture as such. It is all recorded in art, in song and in story. To some people it may just look like dots and beautiful arrangements and beautiful shapes. But there's nothing accidental. Every area, every group has a form or a style that is very significant to their area, but it also has all of the story. Every single thing had cultural significance. Whether it was the cloud formation, whether it was streaked, whether it was flat, there was a story. Whether the sand was streaked, whether the sand was flat, what the footprints were, whether the water pool was muddy, whether it was clear, had a very significant story.
As with most of our culture, it's been displaced and written about by hundreds of different people writing their own theses. You can collect everything ever written before 1980 and put it in a hall, and people will still walk out of that hall not understanding one piece of that epistemology.
On many levels it's viewed as a nice song or a good painting. However, the messaging behind it and the backstory is often where the strongest affirming voice comes from. The concepts of humanity within the art forms and your way in which you engage with it is obviously subject to your approach to it.
For me, as a young man, I saw a lot of conflict that I could not explain, and because it's the only thing you see, you're living in a vacuum, I couldn't put in any context other than this is normal life. And it wasn't until the late 80s where I realised, my gosh, I come from a place that has a intense and profound conflict with its ancient cultural inhabitants, with the traditional owners of the land.
As the old story goes, that Captain Cook landed and saw these natives and declared Australia as terra nullius, or as nobody lived here. There was no prior occupation of the land. And that's I think still a very much of a sticking point for Australia, because we're not even recognised in the Constitution. So I think the biggest impact the colonisation had, in particular on our culture, was the lack of respect and the lack of understanding of who we are as a people and what we provide.
Communities who can traditionally grow and maintain their own existence are forced into squalid conditions by government. A lot of them are under an interventionist program at the minute, where they don't have access to this economic world that we're sort of forced to play in. But that's why it's important to do what we do as festivals, as arts practitioners, because that's a safe space where you can come together irrespective of your economic status or your level of disadvantage. You can come as a cultural practitioner, as an artist, you can come and just be. To share that, and for more people to appreciate it, means that, this story can be told and can be heard, and you feel like you are paying your way forward. But you're also, informing people through your arts practice, your story, and the importance of that in the greater Australian identity and the global Indigenous identity.
I found a lot that young people, they feel that artistic pursuits are a way to connect to their cultural heritage, because it's seen as an acceptable Indigenous way of being, to be artistic. They feel that it connects them with their heritage. It's a very strong tool for engaging kids in a conversation around identity and cultural heritage.
I belong to the Darug, people of Sydney. Inagaya, Bayalawa, Bayalawa. And I speak my language. Of course, I wasn't raised speaking it traditionally, but reclamation is a huge part of education. And when I was young, I was very angry. Couldn't understand why I was getting caned at school, told that my people didn't exist. Yet I was going home to see community.
I was completely removed from Aboriginal culture in that Aboriginal way, and it wasn't until I was 17 that I went home to be with my nan and pop back up in Cape York. And so I was brought from the city, injected into a family, and then just ceremony became a way of life for me.
I want to work with children who have lost their identity, their land and their culture and all that. I believe that changes can be made through music, because music practically constructs every area of the brain and envelopes it.
We're really working hard to change that deficit language of disadvantage that we so often hear in the media, and just in general everyday conversation when it comes to talking about Indigenous people. We really want to turn that on its head and change that conversation to be one of excellence and success, and talk about the amazing resilience that exists within the communities across the country. And the reason that conversation is so important is really to change this country into a place that is a safe one for our kids, for our kids' kids. We want this to be a country that they own and they know as a place that is theirs, and recognise the importance of who they are in the history of this country.
Anyone that walks into, whether it be a gallery or a performance, and takes the time to understand, will automatically become agents for preservation of culture.
We are, at the end of the day, 2.5% of the population. So if we want to see real social change in this country, that's a change that has to happen on both sides of the fence. And art can be a very strong way of doing that.
You automatically understand the great importance of preserving these ancient cultures that are on the brink, on a very dangerous position of being interrupted totally or disappearing.
Our old people, who probably only 4 or 5 years ago were very, very reticent when it comes to using modern technology to record their stories. So we're finding now that the old people are recognising that when they go, our stories go. When our stories go, our culture follows. So they're very strong now in coming back to us as modern storytellers and going, please record my story. Please keep this on record so that you can share this with our future generations.
So, Aboriginal people have been oppressed, displaced, uprooted, and impoverished on their own homelands. Sam, can you give us a little bit of insight on how ancient cultures have remained connected to spirit and strife through all of this?
Yep. First, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Turtle Island and the sovereignty that was never ceded. As an Indigenous person, just to give you a bit of context, I come from the Nigina Nation, which is the Kimberley region of Western Australia. And you've seen some footage. My country is red dirt and big blue sky, massive anthills, and then everything else is massive, like crocodiles and kangaroos. But when I speak, because I grew up on country in Nigina country, that's where I'm talking from. So my worldview is not the suede boots that you see on stage. It's actually coming from a cultural continuum, a culture that is embedded with art and culture being central to our identities. So it's more, as we spoke of in the documentary, it's more than a painting. Our continuum is vitally important that it is encoded and decoded through cultural practice and artistic practice and expression as a living cultural entity of the pluralistic Indigenous Australias.
So, Alaka, why is this displacement happening so rapidly, quicker than ever before, and how do we protect this cultural continuum?
Thanks, and thank you, Sam, for being here with us today, and Marla for that wonderful teaser of the film, which we can't wait to see the whole film. But it's hard to know where to start, but let me just start by saying that since the 1970s, I would say, the acceleration of extraction of natural resources from parts of territories that previously were not exposed to the level of extraction that is going on now. And I'm talking about increased mining, increased oil extraction, gold rush, all of these kinds of, there's been a boom of that form of extraction, people going into, corporations and governments enabling corporations to go into these regions that were considered remote or terra nullis, which they never were. I work in the Amazon regions of the Western Amazon in Peru, Bolivia, and those areas similar to what is happening in Australia, and even here in our own country, we see this intensification of extraction. And that, I think, is what's accelerating the displacement of peoples from lands where they had, in fact, found refuge, because those were lands that were like, they were displaced there to begin with, because they owned the entire territories, right? And then they were displaced to these more remote areas, and now these remote areas are being exploited for energy. A lot of it has to do with the increased use of energy by the rest of us, all of us.
So here's a question for both of you. Considering the quick pace of deterioration, are these threats greater or is the resilience greater?
The threat's greater in the sense that, just in terms of population density, we are a small number, but resilient in the sense that with the sense of global unity, the ability to have the global conversations through social media, through identifying very similar situations, such as what's happening in North Dakota as a mirror to other regions around the world, makes it vitally kind of important and critical that we have those conversations. But the reality is that, especially in Australia, Australia is not a country, it's not a nation. It was an illegal occupation from the Indigenous worldview, because there was never any treaty, there was never any acknowledgement of us as Indigenous people having a pre-existing cultural continuum that went from time immemorial. So when you're up against a regime of illegal occupation that is presented in a Western context as this is the great nation of Australia, the ally of the United States,
you're batting up against the capitalist system and the mechanisms that are globally grinding to a halt and kind of pressing down on the global Indigenous people. The narrative of the master narrative starts to speak on our behalf, and what they present often is the impoverished story of our people and not the resilience.
And I think that's a really critical point, because we do tend to focus a lot on the displacement, on the loss, et cetera, of culture, and we could debate whether in fact culture ever gets lost, so we could talk about that a little later. But I think the concept of resilience, and how is it that people have in fact, not only just survived the displacement and the occupation of territories and disruption of their life through forcibly children being taken away from parents, and I'm talking about globally, this has happened to Indigenous people, and being told that you cannot speak your language. How is it possible that with all of that, folks have survived and thrived and continue to maintain a way of life and a worldview that's very different from the Western worldview, from the capitalist worldview, they have values that are different? How is that possible? And that's, I think, where I think we want to sort of give thought to the centrality of art in people's lives, and the way that stories, songs, visual, dance, everything you saw in that 10-minute, that oftentimes we take it for granted, or we use it to exoticize folks, because, oh yeah, we've seen Aboriginal people dance, or we've heard the didgeridoo, et cetera, and we don't pay attention to it. But the fact is that ability to have maintained a way of thinking, a way of being, is really related to this way of, well, I think someone in the film says, art is everyday life. And I think that's been key to resilience. That's at least what I've seen and experienced in places I've worked, and what I see in our museum collections too, because when we look through the objects that we have in our collections, you see we have something like, 1,000 spoons or more just in the Native American spoons that we use every day. They're all beautifully crafted. Why is that? How did that happen? What went into thought about that?
I was just going to say, the Indigenous worldview doesn't have art and culture as an elective. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's who you are and what you represent. It's the way that you can have respectful exchange amongst different nations, because trade is really important, and you trade with your cultural identity coming to the forefront. That's how the language of the non-verbal, how the language of the visual, how the language of silence is all measured within Indigenous communities, because who you are and what you represent doesn't fit neatly into a box, and that's always going to be the difficulty in an imposition within a Western paradigm, where you're forced to tick a box and be representative of what that is. Because when you talk about a painting or the yidaki, the didgeridoo, you're not aware that some regions within Aboriginal Australia do not play that instrument, that women aren't allowed to play that instrument. You're not aware that on a macro level, there's so much diversity within that the coding within the language of dance becomes critical, because it is communication tools that we're using, and it's the way that story and song has been able to keep people with enough clues so that they can come home and return to country. And I gave an example just recently. Australia has a slavery story that they hide, and it came from blackbirding, where they scooped up a lot of Melanesian communities in Vanuatu and New Caledonia, and they brought them to Australia to work on the cane fields. In 1910, they repealed that through the Pacific Island Act and deported everyone. What they did, though, was that they weren't discerning as to who they removed, and they took and forcibly removed Aboriginal people as well in that population, because I guess, from a Western worldview, they didn't necessarily care a whole lot. So using dance as a language, community members who were deported to countries that were unfamiliar to them and it wasn't their land, were able to carry narratives through their family through dance, so that when community members from Vanuatu came to Australia, they said, look, we have an Aboriginal connection, and they told their story. And in that story, they also sung a song, and in that song, the words that they were singing that they weren't familiar with were all words that related to geography. And it told them exactly what nation they were from and what part of Australia that they were from. So we were able to then artistically curate a program that brought ceremony back into that region, and we brought the community onto their traditional land. So we were able to bring our people home.
And I think that's like resonates so much, because the relationship between art and place, and you saw that a little bit too in the documentary, and the hold that place has, so even if you're miles and miles and miles or thousands of miles displaced from your homeland, you remember it. It's in your memory, and it's passed on through song or through visual art, to children and their children and their children's children. And then that becomes this way of connecting back, and that also is part of resilience, that ability to hold on to place.
So Alaka, from an anthropological perspective, how has social justice advocacy encouraged connectedness to communities? And maybe you could give us an example from working in the Amazon.
Ooh. How has social justice...
So being an advocate for social justice when you went to the Amazon.
How
did you bring communities together in doing so?
Well, as an anthropologist, what we try to do is we try to understand, as an outsider to the culture that we're trying to work with, we try to understand that culture from the best we can from the perspective inside that culture. So it's this kind of tension, and I know anthropology is very problematic and all that. I acknowledge that. But at the same time, I've been very privileged to live with Indigenous peoples in the Amazon, in Central America, a little bit here, in this country too. And what you begin to see, and this is also true of folks in cities who are also, feeling quite a bit of oppression these days and before, is that they're not conceiving of themselves as victims of these processes of oppression. They're not, seeing themselves as folks who cannot do anything about that. In fact, they see themselves as people who do try to continue to resolve the concerns that they have. And our job as anthropologists and as advocates for social justice, and there is really no, in my opinion, no tension or contradiction between being a scientist or social scientist and being an advocate. So for social justice, our job is to bring to the fore the characteristics and values and ways in which people themselves are constructing social change. And then how do those avenues or strategies for social change, how can they then be amplified to help all of us? Because in the end, it's not as if the struggles of Indigenous people are separate from our struggles. We need to be in tune. I mean, do we want to live in a world where extraction is ever accelerating? What does that mean for all of us? Do we want to live in a world where oil has more privilege than water? which is the fight that's going on in North Dakota today? Is that what we want for our world? What is our choice? And so I think all of these ways in which Indigenous peoples are bringing these questions and continuing to question the systems under which we live, those are important questions for all of us.
Yeah, our approach is actually to use cultural authority as a mechanism to lead social justice change, and in a way which is vitally important, because currently in Australia they have made announcements that they're forcibly closing 120 Aboriginal communities, and why they're doing that is exactly as described. It's the mineral-rich land that we live on. So in order for them to do that, they've repealed the Heritage Act across 3,175 traditional sites, and they've increased the exploration licences. So there's 1,000 active exploration licences in my region alone. They've announced the expansion of the white paper, which ironically is about the expansion across our country of mining and building these super cities that displace everybody in their traditional homelands. So in Yagana country, we still live on that country. I can go back and I can stand on the land of my ancestors from the beginning of time, and that is powerful, and that is what we're fighting for. So when the government make these announcements, we have a saying that we try to stay quiet, but our ancestors don't let us. So we then look at what, within our capacity and our means, how can we be a resistance front? So with the government making those announcements, with that rich country, and it's not only just the cultural value, it's the archaeological and geographical value of what that represents. This is ancient land we're talking about. To have that really short-term view of I can exploit this to the end of the earth at the expense of all of your cultural continuum is what we are fighting up against. So using the power of social justice through global awareness, using these new tools, which aren't so new anymore, through social media, by being able to have the conversations here today, just keep bringing these conversations forward, but also within unity, because we do recognise that this is a global Indigenous and people of colour struggle. And so we do recognise other movements such as Idle No More and the Dakota Pipeline and Black Lives Matter. We stand strong in unity with these through our own mechanisms.
Which segues nicely, because I was going to ask about your political activism with your social media campaign, and you built it up to 20 million strong. So maybe you could tell a little bit about what you were fighting for and how you built that up.
Yep. So in 2014, the state government of Western Australia said that they would be forcing the closure of Aboriginal communities. What they're talking about is my family. They're talking about other family members where we know enough of our own mob to kind of know who they're talking about. They're talking about communities that maybe have 200 people, but these are people who are living traditionally in their own nation. And so within cultural authority, are repressed in the government mechanism, because the government make it difficult for you to access all the municipal services and basic rights as any other Australian would be afforded. So on one particular evening, I was in my pyjamas, and the community in Western Australia, because I've been living on the east coast, so there's a 2-hour time difference, they said, we need help. They were very familiar with the fact that I was an early adopter of the internet, one of the sort of early Aboriginal people on social media. So my elders called and they said, can we do something? And I said, yes, let's. So in a very short space of time, we set up SOS Black Australia. I then set up through Facebook a social media action plan, which was all on the fly because we did this in 6 days. Within the space of 6 days, we'd set up social media presence, we'd had the hashtag, we'd had the visual identity that was sort of out in the global space. People were kind of co-opting this for their image. we were responsive to the communities, but most importantly, we were connected to all the communities that were being affected by the forced closure statements. And what this meant was we set up an organisers group on Facebook, which was just a closed group. And then I literally had to show people how to use this technology, because not everyone knows, how to use the Facebook, as a lot of our mob call it. But also, they don't need to. They don't bother about it, because it's actually quite busy in really remote communities, even though it doesn't look like. There's all sorts of commitments that go on country. So overnight I said, look, we've got about 500 people now, and everyone was excited that we had 500 people. They couldn't believe 500 people cared. Overnight we grew to 5,000 people, and then they were shocked. Within 6 months we'd scaled up to a reach of 20 million, and we had people like Angela Davis holding this sign up. Dr. Cornell West came out to Australia and visited us. We had Hugh Jackman, as an Australian celebrity, stand up, and a whole lot of artists began the Cultural Revolution, which in a movement is an organic thing. So people have a natural response to want to tell a story through song and dance and performance and visual arts, and street murals were going up. And so we took this offensive to the streets. We unified the 800 Aboriginal nations, and we shut down every capital city in Australia. We did that by marching through the main streets of every capital city and territory, and then we stopped in the main intersections, and what we did was we performed culture and celebrated our identities. And we stayed there during probably the equivalent of the rugby league grand finals and the Cubs. Then we blocked the intersection, and we celebrated on traditional land, irrespective of the concrete that went above it. And that wasn't enough for government. So we did it again. And then we did it again. And on the 1st of May, we had 99 global actions. And we actually had one here in Chicago, and I'd like to acknowledge Josh, who looked within his capacity to just create something and stand with us. And he went to the Australian consulate and he handed out information on our behalf, and we stood in solidarity globally. This was important, and it was important to know that all of this information and what we were doing was so directly connected to remote and regional communities in Aboriginal Australia. It prompted them to start marching within communities, and we're talking 200 people marching, 500 metres, a couple of yards, because there's really, small communities. So, but taking to social media and showing these protests globally, we did a virtual protest where people were able to hold up a sign and make their statement, and we privileged every single community member who did that throughout the world, who stood up, and we watched the unity and the pride build. And that's been powerful, because what that's done is create this unifying critical mass where all of our key issues, such as black deaths in custody, such as the stolen generations, were all given respect within SOS Black Australia. So we stood there with all of our issues as one, and then we took that to the world. So we achieved something in a relatively short space of time, but what we do say is that we made history, but we've got to make the change. We still have the commitment to the 120 communities up in my country to do something that keeps them on country, and at the moment it's about standing up against the government agenda, which by July 2017 they're removing financial subsidy to stop the power or access to power, which leads to a massive problem, because all the water pumps that are fueling communities are run by generators. So you close by stealth now. You change the rhetoric of government. You change it from, we can't sustain these poor people up in these remote communities. It's now, well, we're removing all the health services, the education services. We're making it impossible for you to have access to all of this. Therefore, you will be moving anyway, because we're going to make it so disgusting for you to want to stay on your own country, you poor people. And that's the government line as it currently stands. what they don't realise is that our elders have said, which is why we keep motivated, they said they will not be leaving. And what that means is that they will stay and will themselves to death. And so we can't allow that as our generation currently holding the mantle for our cultural libraries to be destroyed.
I'd like to open it up to any questions. And if you raise your hand, there'll be somebody to come around with the microphone.
Ms. Cook, thank you very much for your comments. And please excuse my lack of knowledge, but could you say a little bit more about the legal and political status of the Indigenous people in Australia? For example, are they citizens? Is their existence acknowledged in the Constitution in any way? Can they vote?
In 1967, they had a referendum which Aboriginal people weren't allowed to participate in. So on our behalf, citizens of Australia allowed us to become citizens of Australia. It's the irony of occupation. So up until that point, it was terra nullius, which was the definition of non-existent inhabitation, which leads into what's problematic about the whole occupation was that Captain Cook was actually given instructions that he must treaty, and he treated in other areas, Aotearoa as an example, so New Zealand. There were mechanisms in place where treaty was happening, however they just bypassed all of that. They said there was nothing to see here, and that began the great land grab of 1788. We were then classified as flora and fauna, so we were the Department of Plants and Animals and Natives, and had all sorts of, segregation in place in the same way as America did. So we identified immediately with the civil rights movements that were happening here and the Indigenous rights movements that were happening in America, and the trade routes existed through Marcus Garvey and beyond, where our people were starting to hear what was going on, and he did that through the merchant seamen. So unions and all of that kind of mechanism started to create global awareness, because when you're a small community in isolation, you're not aware of how powerful you potentially could be. So that global awareness from the days of Marcus Garvey and entertainers, people like Harry Belafonte, were coming to Australia. Paul Robeson were coming to Australia and saying, this isn't right. We started to become more aware, and with that we became more powerful in unity, and so a lot of movements happened in Australia and in Aboriginal Australia that were from the United States. The Black Panther movement happened in Australia, and then we started to take on our own cultural movements and identities, which is a big feat for 800 countries coming together. You're asking the whole of Europe to, become the European Union and no one Brexit, so it's kind of one of those platforms. So we got status and recognition and the right to vote in 1967, but that in some states and territory wasn't until 1972, so we're talking just over 40 years ago. And when you think about intergenerational, some things just haven't shifted and changed. So that state of mind from 40 years ago is still pretty current. And Australia at the moment, as you heard with the United Nations, is abhorrent. It's a lurch to the right. It's kind of, Trump territory taken over. So we're in a really disturbing time within Australia in terms of things around their notion of their own superiority and moving forward. So they've repealed the Discrimination Act. They've taken away a lot of the mechanisms that protected Indigenous people and Muslim communities and asylum seekers, and they've blatantly done this in the eye and the gaze of the world. So that's kind of where we're at the moment.
Has this withdrawing of social services begun already? And if so, is it being challenged in the court?
It's already happened in 2 communities, Kanana and Umulgari, where they've bulldozed the communities and levelled them so people can't go back to country. They had no plan in place for this, so what happened was displacement occurred. So they moved the community members to a township called Wyndham. They had 3 houses designated as priority housing, so they bumped off elders in the community who were in that wait list, and these are people on dialysis and things like that, and they overcrowded the houses. So these houses have around about 20 to 30 people within them. It's a 3-bedroom house, just to give you context. So with that then, people who didn't have access to that housing facility just now live on the outskirts of town or on the football ovals, and there's no plan of government to support that. It's kind of created another wave of displacement, because when you move into someone else's country without cultural authority, you're diaspora, so you don't have the same power as you do being on your traditional lands. And so all the community members who are traditional to Umulgari have no jurisdiction culturally in the area around Wyndham. So it's the government has no plan, but they have a vision for expansion, and it's the great land grab of 2015, 2016, 2017.
What about court action concerning that?
So there is a degree of court action, but not within Australia, because you can't fight the mechanism from within. The justice system is broken. And the only way in order to do that is through a global court of appeals, so The Hague. That's the only way we're going to get justice, because what happens in you go to the High Court of Australia and they say, well, nothing to see here. And we've got countless examples in Aboriginal communities where this resistance has happened, where this stand has been taken. Yulgala and the state is a really important case, because the state of Western Australia had a 1% royalty, where the English constitution, when it was established in Western Australia in 1829, had this provision within the constitution that said Aboriginal people should be funded either up to £5,000 or 1%. And you look at the economy of Western Australia, which is the biggest portion of the country and the biggest mineral-rich area, we've never received that economic restitution. And so it went to the High Court of Australia, and the Aboriginal elders that were involved in that from the Pilbara region were just shouted out, and they all passed away, unfortunately, through that whole trauma of it all. So we understand the justice mechanism of Western space within Australia doesn't work for us.
Thank you for making us aware of the issues and the problems. Awareness is the first step, but what can we as Humanities Festival attendees do to help support the Indigenous movement, since you have very little recourse in the courts and in the legislature, it sounds like, in the government? So, what can we do to support the movement and other Indigenous people's movements?
So we addressed that through SOS Black Australia. What we asked of people was to look and reach within your own capacity, have this conversation with yourself about what you are able to do within your capacity. For me, I had a little bit of time to lead a social revolution, and that was my capacity. In my pyjamas, yeah, actually, that's a whole nother story, but yeah, in my pyjamas with cups of teas, but that was, it was a critical thing, but also because as an artist and a visual designer, I was able to quickly create ways of communicating and ways of getting our messaging across globally. I then set up, I set up in 2015 a website for sosblackaustralia.com, and what that asked for was no money. It actually asked for people to identify what their capability was. And so we had offerings from all around Australia, and these are the logistical stuff. It's, for example, someone goes, I drive a freight truck up the coastal road 2 times a week, and I have backfill space. And then somebody said, I have some solar panels, and we could donate the solar panels. and we could put them on the truck, and if you meet us on the road, you know, so we have these conversations. When the government said that if the children don't have access to education, we will remove the children from your communities, the teachers' union got together and they voted and they said, well, what we'll do is we'll roster and take our annual leave, and we'll all go up and we'll keep the schools open, or we'll do a distance education program. So then that crosses and makes it difficult for government to have the ability to shut down on that merit. When they started to close the medical centres and facilities in communities, the unions got involved again, and they said, well, we'll do similarly to the teachers' union, and we'll roster ourselves on and take holidays and come up on country. And so that's what we'd asked of people. We also got messages from people all around the world. They said, well, we're not in Australia, what can we do? And the biggest offering were things like what Josh was able to do. He said, well, I'm in Chicago, there's an Australian High Commission in Chicago. If you can get me a digital copy, I can print that out and I can tell people what's going on, and we can have that conversation. And the one thing Australia really doesn't like is negative exposure, because they like to present, you know, the land down under, the bronzed Aussie kind of mentality. When you challenge that, they get really awkward and uncomfortable. So globally, that is a powerful thing, but also for the other movements around the world, for us all to come together in unity without overriding each other's narrative, but actually to stand together in solidarity, that's important too.
And I think here in Chicago, and one of the best things we can do is to educate ourselves about the struggles and of the Indigenous peoples. And this is not a struggle of the 19th century. It's not a struggle of the 20th century. It is a struggle of the 21st century. And for people to be aware that even today, you know, Indigenous peoples around the world, whether it's in the Amazon, whether it's in Australia, are facing these kinds of severe displacement and loss of lands and so on is really critical to figuring out what to do. And the other thing you can do is think about this issue of extraction and what can we all do together. I mean, when you have people saying climate change is a hoax, fight against that. You can do that. All of you are, you know, influential people in your own networks who can spread the word about how important, what is the message that Indigenous peoples are saying to us, and spread that message, educate yourself about what it is, why people are resisting, you know, this process of extraction and who's behind the extraction, because they're global companies. They're not just the Australian government. It's in cahoots with global corporations that are doing this. So, you know, educate ourselves, and that's within our capacity. And, you know, there's Google, there's Wikipedia and all that. Don't have to read the scholarly books to learn about what's going on.
And there's a lot of footage on YouTube. So if there's a regional block, because there's a bit of censorship going on within Australia, let us know and we get it to you in alternative ways.
I assume that a lot of the Indigenous people, when they have been displaced, get absorbed by the cities nearby, Perth and whatever other cities are on the West Coast. If that's true, how are they doing in those cities, and how hard or easy is life made for them once they start getting, you know, generations into living in the cities?
So when you talk about Perth, which the Nyungan name for that's Borlu, you're talking about someone else's country. So the complexity of displacing someone from Kanana, which is in a region called the Goldfields, was doubly so, because if anyone's familiar with the Maralinga situation, where the British government and Australian government detonated nuclear bombs to test them and obliterated all the Indigenous communities and country around that particular region, they displaced everyone to Kanana, which created complexity because it was in another area, not within their traditional homelands, which they could never go back to. So when they closed Kanana and they moved everyone to different regions, what you see now is a lot of people from the goldfields living on the fringes in the ovals, the football kind of grounds, and living rough on the street because there really isn't that mechanism in place. The government has moved the budget line to militarisation in Australia, so they've taken a lot away from social services, so you don't have access to some of the basic social services in Australia anymore. And it's difficult because the conversation and the respectful cultural protocol to go into Noongar country is to meet with their elders and say that, we are living on your country, is it okay? And I had to do that as a Nigina person coming down into Wajak country. And they don't have the ability to do that because they're already forced out and they're living on a particular road not far from a hospital. So some of these guys are on dialysis and they need to be able to kind of get up to whatever services. So there's nothing in place. It creates more complexity, and especially on some of the smaller towns around those regions as well. And if you look at the goldfields as an example, the town of Kalgoorlie, which recently had a young Aboriginal boy mowed down and murdered because he was on a motorcycle, and this non-Indigenous man decided he would just go hunt him, created a big complexity which was now echoing through the shire, the local shire, in the way in which they respond to Aboriginal people. So they've basically said, we don't want you in this area, even if it's their traditional country as well. So, that's the complexity.
Thank you. So projects like this documentary are vital to educating through art, and visual media inspire people to learn about issues and then take action. So your question was spot on in that we encourage everybody within your own capacity to take action of some kind, whether it's buying responsible Indigenous art to help an artist on a homeland, or contribute to a crowdfunding site, or just go on social networks and continue the conversation. You've got a note card on your seat. Please support our project, share the Artists of the First Sunrise Project with friends, families, colleagues, and just continue the conversation. So that is one easy thing we can all do. Learn about what's going on with Indigenous communities worldwide and continue that conversation. And that will definitely help bring support to communities in Australia as well as around the globe. So thank you for joining us today. And if you have any questions, we'll be here for a few minutes.